The rain battered Portland's streets, a relentless drumbeat against the windows of the sleek modern mansion perched in the West Hills. Inside, the air was thick with the cloying scent of rosemary roasted lamb and the sharper edge of unspoken resentment. Ethan Caldwell, 35, stood in the glow of a crystal chandelier, his calloused fingers clutching a glass of Pinot Noir. He was a man who'd carved his name into the world with a camera lens. Weddings, grizzly bears in the Cascades, spreads for Vogue. But tonight, in this house, he was nothing more than an outsider, a fraud, according to the people who mattered most to his wife. Margaret Hawthorne, his mother-in-law, glided through the dining room, her smile as polished as the silverware. She was the queen of this domain, a woman who wielded charm like a blade. Her husband, Richard, a real estate titan whose name adorned half the skyscrapers downtown, sat at the head of the table, his eyes glinting with the smug certainty of a man who'd never known failure. To them, Ethan's life, his art, his passion, was a punchline. "When are you going to make real money, Ethan?" Richard had asked earlier, his voice dripping with disdain, as if Ethan's latest National Geographic cover was a child's finger painting. Ethan forced a smile, his jaw tight. He'd been through this before. Every Sunday dinner, every holiday, 7 years of swallowing their barbs for the sake of Sophie, his wife. Sophie, with her ocean blue eyes and fierce love for marine biology, was the only reason he endured this gilded cage. They'd met at an art gallery, her laugh cutting through the pretension, her belief in him a lifeline. But her parents, they'd wanted a son-in-law like Oliver Weston, the cardiologist with a trust fund and a yacht, not a scrappy photographer who'd clawed his way up from nothing. Tonight was Margaret's 60th birthday, a lavish affair with caviar, canapes, and a string quartet in the corner. Sophie had begged Ethan to come, despite his exhaustion from a week-long shoot in the Oregon wilderness. "Just a few hours," she'd said, her hand warm against his. He'd agreed, ignoring the knot in his gut, the one that always tightened when Margaret's eyes lingered on him too long. The meal dragged on, Richard droning about a new waterfront development, Margaret fussing over the table settings. Ethan nursed his wine, counting the minutes until escape. Then Margaret stood, her silk dress shimmering, and announced dessert, a special batch of her famous blackberry cordial. "I'll pour," she said, her voice syrupy, and disappeared into the kitchen. Ethan followed, offering to help, his boots silent on the marble floor. He froze at the threshold. Margaret stood at the counter, her back to him, her movements quick and deliberate. 2 crystal glasses sat apart from the others, one glinting under the light. Her hand hovered over it, a small unmarked vial clutched between her fingers. A clear liquid dripped into the cordial, dissolving into the deep purple. No garnish, no flourish, just a cold, calculated act. She capped the vial, slipping it into her pocket, and turned, her face paling as she saw Ethan. "Evans!" "I didn't hear you," she said, her smile brittle. "This one's for you. My special recipe, just for my favorite son-in-law." Her eyes darted to the glass, and Ethan's blood ran cold. The cordial shimmered, a faint oily film catching the light, unnatural and wrong. He nodded, his throat dry, and took both glasses, his mind racing. Something was wrong, deadly wrong. Back in the dining room, Richard was engrossed in his phone, barely glancing up as Ethan set the tampered glass in front of him. "Cordial, Richard?" Ethan said, his voice steady despite the pulse hammering in his ears. He placed the other glass at his own seat, watching as Richard, oblivious, raised the poisoned drink to his lips. Ethan excused himself, claiming a sudden headache, and swapped his glass for water. 30 minutes later, chaos erupted. Richard lurched from his chair, his face ashen, sweat beading on his brow. He clutched his chest, gasping, then collapsed, his body convulsing violently. Sophie screamed, rushing to her father as Margaret's face drained of color, her eyes locking onto Ethan's across the table. In that moment, he knew she'd meant that drink for him, and she knew he'd switched the glasses. As paramedics stormed the house, Ethan slipped the untouched glass into his coat pocket. his mind a storm of rage and fear. Richard was whisked to the ICU, Margaret stammering about Badberries in the corridor, but Ethan saw the truth in her trembling hands, her fleeting glances. This wasn't an accident. His mother-in-law had tried to kill him. The next morning, while Sophie sat vigil at the hospital, Ethan drove to a toxicology lab, a favor owed by an old client. The results came back by dusk. Fentanyl, a lethal dose, enough to stop a man's heart in hours. Ethan's hands shook as he read the report. Margaret wasn't just cruel, she was a monster. Digging deeper, he uncovered her secret: prescriptions for opioids from 4 doctors, a stockpile of pills, and whispers in Portland's elite circles. A friend poisoned at a gala, missing jewelry at the country club. A trail of suspicion Margaret had buried with her wealth and charm. But Ethan wasn't a pawn in her game. He'd spent years proving he was more than their caricature of a starving artist. And now, with a vial of poison and a lab report in his hands, he was done playing nice. Margaret had underestimated him. She thought she could erase him from Sophie's life. But Ethan Caldwell didn't just capture moments. He built stories. And this one would destroy her. As he drove home under a bruised sky, his phone buzzed. An anonymous text, stark and chilling: "Stop digging, or Sophie pays the price." Ethan's grip tightened on the wheel. This wasn't just about him anymore. Margaret wasn't acting alone, and the stakes were higher than he'd feared. He glanced at the glove box, where the glass and report lay hidden. Whatever game they were playing, he'd finish it, on his terms. The Portland sky hung heavy with the threat of another storm, its bruised clouds mirroring the turmoil churning in Ethan Caldwell's chest. He sat in his cramped studio, the faint hum of a neon sign outside casting flickering shadows across the room. The toxicology report lay on his desk, its stark words, "Fentanyl, lethal dose," burning into his mind. Beside it, the crystal glass from Margaret's birthday dinner, its rim still faintly stained with the poisoned cordial, seemed to pulse with menace. Ethan's phone lay silent, but the anonymous text from last night echoed relentlessly: "Stop digging, or Sophie pays the price." He hadn't slept. Every creak of the old building, every passing car, felt like a warning. Margaret Hawthorne wasn't just a manipulative mother-in-law, she was dangerous. And she wasn't acting alone. Ethan's fingers traced the edge of the lab report, his mind replaying the moment he'd caught her in the kitchen, the vial in her hand, the panic in her eyes when she realized he'd seen her. She'd meant to kill him. And now, with Richard recovering in the ICU, and Sophie at her father's bedside, Ethan was alone, grappling with a truth that could shatter his marriage, or worse. And Margaret and Richard had never attained the level of wealth benevolence. Him and Sophie, laughing on a windswept beach, her hair tangled from the Oregon coast's relentless breeze. That was the Sophie he'd fallen for, fierce, free, unshackled by her parents' expectations. But Margaret and Richard had never approved of him, their disdain a constant undercurrent at every family gathering. They wanted Sophie with someone like Oliver Weston, a cardiologist with a pedigree and a portfolio, not a photographer who built his career from nothing. Ethan had endured their barbs for 7 years, but this was war. His phone buzzed, snapping him back to the present. An email, no sender name, just a subject line: "You were warned." His pulse quickened as he opened it, a single line of text: "Leave Portland by midnight, or she's next." Attached was a photo of Sophie, taken that morning outside the hospital, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. The angle was close, intimate, someone had been watching her. Ethan's hands shook, rage and fear colliding. He forwarded the email to a private server, then deleted it from his inbox. Whoever was behind this thought they could scare him into silence. They didn't know Ethan Caldwell. He grabbed his coat and the lab report, stuffing the glass into a padded case. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to find them hiding in his studio. His first stop was the toxicology lab, where his old client, Dr. Lucas Kane, had run the tests. Lucas was a former photojournalist turned chemist, a man who'd seen enough of the world's underbelly to trust Ethan's instincts. "Fentanyl, Ethan," Lucas said, leaning back in his chair, his lab coat crumpled. "Not just any dose. Military grade, pure enough to drop a horse. Whoever did this wasn't messing around. He slid a folder across the desk. "Here's the full report, plus a chain of custody document. If you're taking this to the cops, it's ironclad." Ethan hesitated. The police were an option, but Margaret's connections ran deep. Portland's elite owed her favors, and Richard's real estate empire had half the city council in its pocket. Going public could backfire, painting Ethan as a paranoid husband, while Margaret played the victim. "Not yet," he said. "I need more first." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "More? Man, you've got a murder attempt in a glass. What's stopping you?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "They're threatening Sophie. I can't risk her." Lucas nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Then, watch your back. People who play with fentanyl don't bluff." Ethan left the lab with the folder tucked under his arm, his mind racing. Margaret had access to opioids, 4 prescriptions, a stockpile of pills, but fentanyl at this purity? That wasn't a pharmacy slip-up. It pointed to something bigger, someone with connections beyond Margaret's country club schemes. As he drove through the rain-slicked streets, he dialed Sophie, his heart sinking when it went to voicemail. "Solve, it's me. Call me back, please. I need to know you're okay." He hung up, the silence in the car deafening. His next move was riskier. Margaret had texted him that morning, her tone saccharine. "Ethan, I'd love for you to take some portraits for my charity gala. Can you come by the house this afternoon?" It was a trap. He knew it, but it was also an opportunity. If he could get her to slip, to admit something on record, he'd have leverage. He packed his camera bag, slipping the lab report inside, and added a small digital recorder for good measure. Margaret wanted to play games? He'd play to win. The Hawthorne mansion loomed against the stormy sky, its glass walls reflecting the churning clouds. Margaret greeted him at the door, her smile as sharp as a blade. "Ethan, darling, thank you for coming. I know things have been tense." Her eyes flicked to his camera bag, searching for something. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. "Let's get to it," Ethan said, his voice clipped. He set up his equipment in the living room, the same room where Richard had collapsed, the memory of that night hanging heavy. Margaret posed by the fireplace, her silk scarf draped artfully, but her hands betrayed her. A slight tremor, a nervous fidget. Ethan snapped a few shots, then lowered the camera. "Before we continue," he said, pulling the lab report from his bag, "we need to talk about this." He slid the folder across the coffee table, watching her face. Margaret's smile froze. She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages, and for a moment Ethan thought she'd deny it. Then she laughed, a brittle, hollow sound. "Oh, Ethan, you're so dramatic. What is this, some kind of prank?" "Fentanyl," he said, his voice low. "Enough to kill me. You poured it into my drink, Margaret. I saw you." Her composure cracked, her eyes darting to the door. "You're delusional. I would never—" "Save it," Ethan cut in, pulling out his phone. "I've got the glass, the report, and a lab willing to testify. You're done." Margaret's face hardened, her mask slipping. "You think you're clever, don't you? You're not good enough for Sophie. You never were. I did what I had to do to protect her." "Protect her?" Ethan's voice rose, incredulous. "By murdering me? You wanted her to think I was a liability, didn't you? Pass out, crash a car, ruin my career, so she'd run back to you." Margaret leaned forward, her voice a venomous hiss. "You're a nobody, Ethan. A dreamer with a camera. Sophie deserves better. I wasn't going to let you drag her down." Ethan hit record on the device in his pocket, his heart pounding. "Say it again, Margaret. Admit you tried to kill me." She froze, realizing her mistake, then stood, her hands shaking. "Get out of my house." "Not until you tell Richard," Ethan said, stepping closer. "Confess to him or I go public. The gala, your charity board, your precious social circle, they'll all know what you are." Margaret's eyes blazed, but she said nothing, her silence damning. Ethan grabbed his bag and left, the recorder still running as he stepped into the rain. He'd gotten what he came for, but the victory felt hollow. Margaret wasn't just a threat, she was a predator, and she'd do anything to keep Sophie under her thumb. By the time he reached his studio, the news was waiting for him. Margaret had struck first. Sophie had called, her voice trembling with anger. "Ethan, what did you do? Mom says you attacked her during the shoot, pushed her, screamed at her." "She's got bruises, Ethan, bruises." Before he could explain, she hung up, and when he tried to call back, her phone was off. Ethan's world tilted. Margaret had played her hand perfectly, turning Sophie against him. He drove to their apartment only to find it empty. Sophie's clothes gone, her suitcase missing, a note on the counter in her hurried scrawl. "I need space. I'm at Mom and Dad's." 3 weeks passed in a blur of silence. Sophie ignored his calls, his texts, his pleas. Margaret's lie had taken root, and Ethan was alone, fighting a war he hadn't chosen. The hits kept coming. His bank called, informing him that his studio loan, crucial for his upcoming gallery opening, had been canceled, citing unforeseen financial risks. Ethan knew better. Richard's influence was everywhere, a shadow strangling his dreams. Then Vogue dropped him from a high-profile shoot, their editor mumbling about client concerns. Ethan's career, his lifeline, was crumbling, and he knew who was pulling the strings. Desperate, Ethan turned to the one person who might understand. Charlotte, married to Sophie's brother Liam. They'd always been kind, but distant, caught in the Hawthorne orbit. When Ethan reached out, Charlotte agreed to meet at a dive bar on the edge of town, far from prying eyes. "I know what they're capable of," Charlotte said, her voice low, her eyes scanning the room. "They tried to ruin me when I married Liam. Lies, rumors, even faked photos of me with another man. I almost lost him." She slid a USB drive across the table. "This is from their security system. I hacked it last year, just in case. You need to see it." Back in his studio, Ethan plugged in the drive, his hands trembling. The footage was damning. There was Margaret in the kitchen, pouring fentanyl into his glass, her movements precise, practiced. Another clip showed Richard, post-hospital, arguing with her in their study. "You went too far, Margaret," he hissed. "He knows." Margaret's response chilled Ethan to the bone. "Then we hire someone, a professional." He disappears, and Sophie comes home. Ethan's stomach lurched. They weren't just plotting his death, they were planning to erase him entirely, to manipulate Sophie into believing he'd abandoned her. The next clip was worse. Margaret and Richard discussing Sophie's past, how they'd hired a private investigator to frame Oliver Weston, her ex-fiancé, for infidelity. "She always comes back to us," Richard said, his voice smug. "She will again." Ethan's rage boiled over, but fear kept him grounded. The anonymous threats, the sabotaged car he'd found that morning, slashed tires, cut brake lines, were no coincidence. Margaret and Richard were closing in, and Sophie was in their crosshairs. He called Charlotte, his voice steady despite the panic. "Why now? Why help me?" "Because they're doing to you what they did to me," she said, "and I'm done watching them destroy lives." Ethan spent the next week in a frenzy, gathering evidence. He tracked down Oliver Weston, now a surgeon in Seattle, who sent him a trove of emails, proof of the Hawthorne's lies, forged photos, and fabricated texts that had ended his engagement to Sophie. Ethan contacted Sophie's old college friends, people who'd mysteriously drifted away, and heard the same story, Margaret's subtle manipulations, Richard's quiet threats. The Hawthornes didn't just control Sophie, they controlled everyone she loved. But the threats escalated. A letter arrived, no return address, containing a photo of Sophie at a coffee shop, unaware of the camera. Scrawled in red ink, "M-mouth, or she's dead." Ethan's resolve hardened. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Sophie, for their future, for the life they'd built together. He invited Liam and Charlotte to his apartment, a risky move but necessary. Sophie needed to see the truth, and Liam's presence might keep her from shutting down. When they arrived, Sophie's eyes were red, her arms crossed, her trust in Ethan fractured. "This better be good," she said, her voice brittle. Ethan connected his laptop to the TV, his heart pounding. "You need to see this," he said, and played the footage. Margaret's cold precision, Richard's complicity, their plan to hire a hitman. It was all there, undeniable. Sophie's face crumpled, tears streaming as the reality sank in. Liam sat frozen, his jaw tight, muttering, "This can't be them." Charlotte reached for Liam's hand. "They did it to us too," she said softly. They'll do it to anyone who threatens their control. Sophie's voice broke. Why didn't you tell me sooner, Ethan? Because I needed you to see it all, he said, his voice raw. Not just what they did to me, but what they've done to you your whole life. The room fell silent, the weight of betrayal suffocating. Sophie stood, her hands shaking. I need to talk to them. Now. Ethan nodded, pulling out a hidden camera from his bag. We're doing this together, and we're recording it. They drove to the Hawthorne mansion, the rain now a torrent, lightning splitting the sky. Ethan set up the camera in the living room, its lens hidden in a bookshelf. Margaret and Richard were waiting, their faces a mask of concern. Sophie, darling, Margaret said, reaching for her. We're so worried about you. Sophie stepped back, her voice steady. No more lies. We know what you did. Richard laughed, dismissive. What is this? Another of Ethan's stunts? He's unhinged, Sophie. Ethan played the footage, the room falling silent as Margaret's guilt filled the screen. Richard's face paled, his bluster gone. Margaret tried to speak, but Sophie cut her off. You tried to kill my husband. You've controlled my life, my choices, my happiness. It ends now. Liam stood, his voice shaking with anger. You did this to me too. To Charlotte. We're done. Ethan handed Richard a USB drive, his voice cold. This has everything. Footage, emails, Oliver's testimony. Interfere again, and it goes to the press, your investors, your entire world. Richard's eyes met Ethan's, a flicker of fear breaking through his arrogance. You're tougher than I thought, he said quietly. You have no idea. Ethan replied. 8 months later, the Hawthorns kept their distance, their empire intact, but their influence over Sophie and Liam severed. Sophie's pregnancy announcement at Christmas stunned them, a quiet victory for Ethan. Richard's offer of a corporate job was a desperate play, swiftly rejected. The gift of a $2 million 0-cents mansion and a trust fund for their unborn daughter, Ava, was no apology, just a concession, a sign they'd lost. Ava was born in the fall, her tiny hand curling around Ethan's finger, a promise of a new beginning. Richard hired Ethan for a global ad campaign, a nod to his talent, but Ethan's true triumph was the gallery he opened in Seattle, packed with friends, clients, and Sophie by his side, Ava in her arms. Margaret and Richard attended, their presence brief, their approval grudging, but real. As Ethan locked up the gallery that night, Sophie leaned against him, the city lights glittering below. They'll never change, she said, her voice soft. No, Ethan agreed, but we have. And that's enough. He'd won not by playing their game, but by refusing it, by protecting what mattered with truth, not schemes. The lesson was clear. Real strength wasn't in revenge, but in living well on your own terms with the people you love. And as the stars emerged over the Puget Sound, Ethan knew he'd done just that.